A sealed letter can conceal both an act of love and a death sentence. In the right hands, it can bring life. In the wrong ones, it can seal a tragic fate. This is the story of a man who unknowingly carried his own condemnation while marching with honor across the desert. A soldier whose unwavering loyalty became the perfect instrument for his destruction. What drives a king blessed by God to use the duty and honor of his own warrior to eliminate him? How did the same man who defeated the giant Goliath with a stone transform into someone capable of killing with a letter? And why would a valiant soldier, even when given the chance to save his life, choose a path that would lead him straight to death? When power, desire, and betrayal meet, even the greatest of kings can fall into the trap of his own desires. The story of Uriah the Hittite shows us how an ordinary man became the centerpiece in one of the greatest scandals in biblical history, a deadly triangle involving King David and Bathsheba. This story brings a perspective on loyalty and betrayal that few know. A drama where the letter condemning a man to death was in his own hands, and he, out of honor, ensured it was delivered. How can a man become the messenger of his own destruction? And what does this ancient tragedy reveal about the nature of power and human weakness? The scorching sun punished the streets of Jerusalem, while the royal palace stood majestically over the city. It was spring, the season when kings went out to war. The harvests were stored, the roads were dry, and armies could march without the impediment of winter rains. But this year something was different in the kingdom of Israel. King David, the same young shepherd who had defeated the giant Goliath and unified the tribes of Israel, was not leading his troops on the battlefield. While his men fought against the Ammonites in distant Rabbah, David remained in Jerusalem, comfortably settled in his cedar palace on Mount Zion. The great warrior who had faced lions with his bare hands now rested on sheets of fine linen. It was a time of prosperity for Israel. After years of constant wars, the kingdom finally knew a period of relative peace and abundance. The borders were secure, enemies were subdued, and trade flourished. The small kingdom of shepherds had transformed into a regional power under David's leadership. In one of the houses near the palace lived Uriah the Hittite. As his name indicates, he was not an Israelite by birth, but a foreigner who had left his homeland to serve in David's army. The Hittites were known as exceptional warriors, and Uriah had proven his worth in numerous battles, earning his place among the men of the king's personal guard, the famous mighty men of David. Uriah was married to Bathsheba, a woman of rare beauty, daughter of Eliam, also one of David's mighty men, and possibly the granddaughter of Ahithophel, the king's counselor. Bathsheba belonged to a respected family in Jerusalem. Her marriage to Uriah united two families dedicated to royal service. Like every soldier's wife of the time, she faced long periods of solitude while her husband fought on the kingdom's frontiers. The houses in Jerusalem were built on terraces on the mountainside. The rooftop terraces were used for various domestic activities, such as drying fruits or washing clothes. They also served as a cool place to sleep on hot summer nights. These terraces were exposed to the view of anyone who might be at a higher point in the city, such as the royal palace. The Israelite army was camped in the outskirts of Rabbah, the capital of the Ammonites, east of the Jordan River. It was a routine military campaign, part of the consolidation of Israelite power in the region. General Joab, David's nephew and commander of his forces, led the siege of the city. Among his most trusted officers was Uriah, who had left his wife in Jerusalem to fulfill his military duty. It was in this setting, an idle king in his palace, while his men fought, a woman alone performing her household tasks, and a loyal soldier on the battlefield, that one of the darkest stories in the biblical narrative began to unfold. A story of desire, power, and betrayal that would end with an honorable man marching to his own death. It was a stifling afternoon when David, restless after his rest, decided to walk on the terrace of his palace. From above, his view reached much of the city. It was then that his eyes caught a movement on the terrace of a nearby house. Down below, a woman was bathing. The distance was not enough to hide her extraordinary beauty. David stopped, observed, felt desire grow within him like a storm forming on the horizon. The king who had conquered entire nations now found himself conquered by a simple glance. Without hesitation, he sent a servant to discover who that woman was. "It is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite," the messenger reported upon returning. "Wife of one of his soldiers, wife of one of his mighty men." This information should have been enough to stop the king, but desire had already taken deep root. David sent messengers to bring her to the palace. A royal request was not something one could refuse. Bathsheba came, and that night the king of Israel betrayed the trust of one of his most loyal warriors. When she returned home, the secret was planted like a seed that would soon germinate into tragedy. Weeks passed. Life in Jerusalem followed its normal course, while in Rabbah the siege continued. It was then that a messenger arrived at the palace with news that changed everything. Bathsheba was pregnant, and with her husband absent for months on the battlefield, there was no way to hide who the father of the child was. Panic seized David. The king who had faced armies now trembled at the prospect of his sin coming to light. The law of Moses was clear: adultery was punishable by death. Although he was king, David knew there were limits to his power. A scandal of this magnitude could shake the foundations of his reign. It was necessary to find a solution, and quickly. David saw a way out. If Uriah returned home and spent a night with his wife, everyone would presume the child was his. So the king sent an order to Joab: Uriah should return to Jerusalem immediately to bring news of the siege. The Hittite soldier arrived in the capital covered by the dust of the road. Straight from the battlefield, he was led into the king's presence. David received him with honors, asking about Joab, about the soldiers, and about the progress of the war. Uriah responded with the precision of an experienced military man, giving strategic details of the battle. At the end of the audience, David smiled and said, "Now go down to your house and wash your feet." It was a clear invitation for him to rest and spend the night with his wife. Uriah left the palace, but did not head home. Instead, he lay down at the entrance of the palace with the king's servants. The next morning, David was informed of Uriah's unexpected behavior. "Why didn't you go home after such a journey?" asked the king when he summoned him again. Uriah's response revealed the character of a man for whom honor came before personal comfort. "The ark, Israel and Judah are in tents, and my lord Joab and my lord's servants are camped in the open field. How could I go to my house to eat and drink, and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I would not do such a thing." David's plan had failed. Uriah's loyalty now became the greatest obstacle to hiding the king's sin. David tried another strategy. He kept Uriah in Jerusalem for another day and invited him to dine at the palace. During the meal, he made sure the soldier drank more than usual, hoping that intoxicated, he would finally go home. But even under the effect of wine, Uriah's sense of duty prevailed. Once again, he slept with the palace guards, refusing to enjoy the comfort of his home while his companions slept on the battlefield. The next morning, David realized that more drastic measures would be necessary. What had begun as a moment of desire had transformed into an increasingly complex web of deception. The king, who had been chosen by God, now plotted a plan to murder an innocent man. With trembling hands, David wrote a letter to Joab: "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." He sealed the message and gave it to Uriah himself, ordering him to take it back to Joab. The loyal soldier, unaware of the letter's contents, departed immediately. He crossed the desert again, under the scorching sun, carrying his own death sentence. The journey back to Rabbah was arduous. The weight of the letter was insignificant compared to the weight of responsibility that Uriah felt. A message from the king to the general in time of war was a matter of the highest importance. During the journey, he may have thought about his wife, about the brief visit to Jerusalem, about the king's strange behavior. But his thoughts soon returned to the battle that awaited him. After days of travel, Uriah finally reached the Israelite camp. The siege of Rabbah continued, with Israel's soldiers slowly tightening the noose around the Ammonite city. He was warmly welcomed by his companions, who were eager for news from home. But before any conversation, Uriah sought out Joab and delivered the royal message. The general, a veteran of countless battles, opened the seal and read the king's orders. His face betrayed no emotion, but inwardly, he must have wondered what grave offense Uriah had committed to deserve such punishment. Joab had known David since youth and had participated in many of his political intrigues. He knew it was not his place to question the king's orders, only to carry them out. The next day, Joab reorganized his forces for an attack on the city. He carefully studied the Ammonite defenses and identified the point where the enemy's most valiant warriors were posted. Then he assigned Uriah to lead the attack precisely at that sector. The battle began at dawn. The Israelite soldiers advanced against the walls of Rabbah, facing a rain of arrows and stones. Uriah, always at the front, led his men with courage, unaware that he had been deliberately placed at the most dangerous point of combat. At the critical moment of the battle, following David's instructions, Joab ordered the support troops to withdraw. Uriah and a few men were left isolated, facing the fury of the Ammonite defenders alone. Even so, the valiant Hittite did not retreat. He fought with the ferocity and skill that had made him famous. But the situation was impossible. Surrounded by enemies without support, Uriah finally fell. His blood mixed with the dust of the battlefield, far from his home, far from his wife, a victim not of Israel's enemies, but of the betrayal of his own king. When the battle ended, Joab sent a messenger to Jerusalem to inform David about the events. He carefully instructed the messenger, first he should report the casualties of the battle, and only if the king showed indignation for having approached too close to the walls, mention Uriah's death. The messenger arrived in Jerusalem and was brought into David's presence. He reported how difficult the battle had been and how some men had fallen. When he mentioned that Uriah the Hittite was among the dead, the king's countenance changed. Instead of continuing to question the battle strategy, David simply said, "Tell Joab, don't let this upset you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it, and encourage him." The coldness of these words revealed how far David had strayed from the man who was once described as after God's own heart. The plan had worked. Uriah was dead, and the way was clear for David to take Bathsheba as his wife, thus legitimizing the child she was expecting. What few know about this story is that Uriah could have saved his own life with a simple gesture. If he had opened the letter, if he had read its contents, he could have fled, could have denounced the king's betrayal. The culture of the time did not prohibit a messenger from knowing the contents of a message he was transporting. More than that, it would even be prudent for a high-ranking officer like Uriah to be aware of the military matters being discussed. However, his integrity and his respect for authority were so great that he preferred to keep the seal intact. Not even natural curiosity led him to violate the privacy of communication between the king and the general. This absolute loyalty, ironically, was what ensured his death. Another rarely discussed aspect is the contrast between Uriah and David at this moment in their lives. Uriah, a foreigner, a Hittite, demonstrated more fidelity to Israelite principles than the king chosen by God himself. While David remained comfortably in the palace, breaking the law and betraying his men, Uriah refused to sleep in his own house out of solidarity with companions who were on the battlefield. Uriah's response when questioned by David, "The ark, Israel and Judah are intense. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife?" contains an implicit accusation. He mentions the ark, symbol of God's presence, as if reminding the king of his sacred responsibilities. This mention must have struck David like an arrow, as it highlighted his departure, not only from his military duties, but also spiritual ones. There is also the significant detail that Uriah was one of David's 30 mighty men, an elite group of warriors personally loyal to the king. The members of this group had risked their lives for David countless times. On a previous occasion, 3 of these mighty men had broken through enemy lines just to fetch water from a specific well that David wished to drink from. Upon receiving the water, the king refused to drink it, pouring it out as an offering to God, because it represented the life risk of his men. What a contrast with his actions now. The same man who would not drink water, obtained at the risk of life now, deliberately sacrificed the life of one of his loyal warriors to cover up his own sin. David's moral fall in this story is much deeper than generally perceived. Another element often ignored is Joab's role in this plot. As an experienced general, Joab probably understood that there was something strange about David's orders. He knew Uriah and his value as a warrior. However, he chose to obey without question. Joab had his own moral stains and had committed murders before, as in the case of Abner. It's possible that David chose Joab to execute this plan precisely because he knew the general would have no scruples in carrying out such orders. There is also the fate of the child born of this illicit union. After Uriah's death, David took Bathsheba as his wife, and she gave birth to a son. But the story doesn't end with a happily ever after. The prophet Nathan confronted David with his sin through a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. When David, indignant, declared that such a man deserved to die, Nathan pointed to him and said, "You are that man." As a consequence of his actions, David was informed that the child would not survive. Despite his prayers and fasting, the baby fell ill and died after 7 days. This is one of the few occasions in the Bible where we see David completely powerless, unable to alter events through his authority or his prayers. However, the story of David and Bathsheba does not end in complete tragedy. Later, they had another son, Solomon, who would become David's successor and the wisest king in Israel's history. Surprisingly, Bathsheba appears in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, one of the few women mentioned in this royal lineage. Another aspect little explored is how this episode affected the kingdom of Israel. From this moment on, David's house never knew complete peace again. Family problems, rebellions, and intrigues multiplied in the following years. His son Amnon raped his own sister Tamar. Another son, Absalom, murdered Amnon and later led a rebellion against his own father, during which he publicly took David's concubines, literally fulfilling Nathan's prophecy that what you did in secret, I will make happen in broad daylight. This chain of events suggests that David's sin with Bathsheba and against Uriah was not just an isolated moral slip, but a turning point that triggered consequences for generations. The king who had united Israel, who had established Jerusalem as the capital, who had defeated all external enemies, now saw his kingdom crumbling from the inside out, beginning with his own family. Perhaps the deepest element of this story is the vulnerability it reveals in David. The great king, the giant killer, the man after God's own heart, proved to be as subject to human weaknesses as any ordinary person. In an age when kings were viewed almost as deities, the biblical narrative does not hesitate to show the moral failures of its greatest monarch. Psalm 51, traditionally attributed to David after this episode, reveals the depth of his repentance. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. It is a universal cry from a soul that recognizes its failure and seeks redemption. This combination of greatness and fallibility, of power and weakness, of sin and repentance, makes David one of the most human figures in Scripture. And at the center of this complex narrative is Uriah the Hittite, whose unwavering loyalty led him to carry his own death sentence across the desert, involuntarily sealing his fate with each step that brought him closer to the battlefield. To discover more fascinating stories like this, simply subscribe to the channel. There are many other biblical characters whose journey reveals profound truths about the human condition, about power, betrayal, redemption, and hope. Uriah's story echoes through the centuries,
because it touches on something fundamentally human, the tension between power and responsibility. When King David observed Bathsheba from his palace heights, he was in a position of extreme privilege. He could see without being seen, desire without being questioned, command without being refused. The absolute power he possessed removed the normal barriers that would prevent an ordinary man from acting on his lowest desires. This is a danger that persists today. How many leaders, executives, celebrities, or people in positions of authority have fallen into the same trap? Believing themselves to be above the rules that govern others, they end up committing acts that destroy innocent lives. Power without responsibility is like a sword without a sheath, dangerous to everyone around, including the one who wields it. On the other hand, Uriah represents something equally timeless, the common person whose integrity surpasses that of the powerful. He had no throne, no riches, not the privilege of staying home while others fought. He was just a soldier, doing his duty. But in his sense of honor, in his loyalty to his companions, in his devotion to principles, he proved greater than the king. There is a terrible irony in the fact that Uriah's virtue, his unquestionable loyalty, was the perfect tool for his destruction. If he had been less honorable, he would have gone home when David suggested it. If he had been less trustworthy, he might have opened the letter and discovered the plot against his life. His righteousness made him vulnerable to the betrayal of someone he respected and faithfully served. This dynamic also persists in our world. How many honest, hard-working people are exploited precisely because of their integrity? How many loyal individuals are betrayed by those they serve? Uriah's story reminds us that virtue, though valuable in itself, is not always rewarded in this world. But the narrative does not end with the triumph of evil over good. Although Uriah died and David initially got away with it, the consequences eventually caught up with him. Not in the form of legal punishment, no human court judged the king, but through a progressive disintegration of everything he had built. His family, his kingdom, his inner peace, all suffered the repercussions of his actions. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the story. No sealed letter can forever hide what we have done. No plan, however clever, can isolate us from the consequences of our choices. The moral universe in which we live eventually brings to light what was done in darkness. Today, as in ancient times, each of us faces choices similar to those of David and Uriah. In moments of power, will we act with responsibility or abuse our position? In moments of testing, will we maintain our integrity, even when it comes at a personal cost? When confronted with our failures, will we seek to hide them, or have the courage to face them? Uriah's fatal journey reminds us that every choice we make carries within it seeds of our future. The loyal soldier carried his death sentence unknowingly, but the king who wrote it carried something even heavier, the weight of his own conscience and the consequences of betraying not just a good man, but his own ideals. In the end, the letter that killed Uriah traveled far beyond the battlefield at Rabbah. It has crossed the centuries, reaching us as a silent reminder that a person's true character is not revealed on the throne or on the battlefield, but in the choices they make when they believe no one is watching.